Great privilege and pleasure to welcome Professor Geraldine van Bueren, Emerita Professor of Queen Mary, University of London, Honorary Senior Fellow of the British Institute of International and Comparative Law, and Visiting Fellow, Kellogg College, Oxford, to the Bima to give the sermon this morning in honour of Human Rights Shabbat. Geraldine held the chair of International Human Rights Law at Queen Mary University. She's a barrister and was appointed an Honorary King's Counsel in recognition of her scholastic contributions to national and international law. She has served as a commissioner on the Equality and Human Rights Commission with lead responsibility for human rights, and on the Attorney General's International Pro Bono Committee. In 2003, Professor Van Bueren was awarded the Child Rights Lawyer Award, acknowledging the outstanding work she has done in the field of children's rights. She is one of the original drafters of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, and also helped draft the UNHCR guidelines on refugee children. Geraldine has lectured widely throughout the world, and her writings have been cited in courts internationally. She founded the Human Rights Collegium at Queen Mary University and served as its director. Thank you so much for agreeing to give the sermon on this Shabbat.
Shabbat Shalom, and Rabbi Alex, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. Chanukkah and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, whose 75th anniversary will be tomorrow, are both based on hope. Chanukkah, considerably older, over 21 centuries ago, commemorates, as we know, when a foreign king of Israel, Antiochus IV, prohibited the public worship of Judaism. As we know also, a small group of Jews, the Maccabees, regained this freedom, and this right to worship publicly is now enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And we sometimes forget that the regaining of freedom was not instant. It took over 3 years. They were able to re-sanctify the temple, clear the considerable wreckage, and light a menorah with oil, which ought, as we know, only to have lasted 1 day. Some people would not have lit the oil, thinking, what's the point? All this just for 1 day. But as the book of Proverbs states, where there is no vision, people perish. Normally on a 75th anniversary, there would be a joyful celebration of human rights. But for obvious reasons, such an event would be inappropriate and tasteless. However, this does not mean that we should lose heart or faith in human rights, nor does it mean that we should forget that all of the achievements that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights treaties, and national laws have achieved in the past 3/4 of a century. Aside from mementos from my husband, family, and friends, one of my most precious objects is a letter from Elie Wiesel. Elie Wiesel, who survived both Auschwitz and the Death March, was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize because despite everything he had been through, he devoted his life to protecting everyone's dignity based on his faith in God and his belief in Jewish religious principles. We'd corresponded about work on human rights and Judaism, and he was very supportive. He wrote that a suffering and suffering confers no privileges. An extraordinarily generous statement from a man who'd suffered so much and lost so many. And this is the approach of human rights, which means that because suffering confers no privileges, it allows for peace to be negotiated, and peace, even if it appears so very elusive as at the moment. if not impossible. As the prophet Zechariah has said, as Rita eloquently quoted, not by strength or by might, but by spirit, says God. Right now, in Israel and Gaza and in Ukraine, peace seems remote, if not impossible. But this same sense of impossibility, some of you may remember, was also found in Northern Ireland and South Africa. The peace negotiated in Northern Ireland, called the Good Friday Agreement, made human rights central to the peace process, and peace could not have been achieved without the human rights framework. The European Convention on Human Rights and a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland are expressly focused upon in the Good Friday Agreement. The European Convention created the European Court of Human Rights, whose first president was the French Sephardi lawyer René Cassin, one of the principal drafters of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. René Cassin had been forced into exile, sentenced to death in absentia, and many of his family were murdered in the Holocaust. Despite all of this, he believed fervently in the universality of human rights and devoted his life to it. They're universal because they belong to each other and every one of us because we are human. In South Africa, at the end of apartheid, was not as violent as many had predicted because of a widely negotiated constitution which is based upon the equality and dignity of all, a principle expressed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Anthony Sampson's account of the early talks between the African National Congress and white South Africans shows the distrust was so great that at the very beginning and for some time afterwards, these talks had to be held in complete secrecy, not even telling their fellow African National Congress members and not even telling other white South Africans. This was the only way to begin building trust and faith in the possibilities of a just peace being achieved. The negotiations were putting into practice what we all need. That, to quote Martin Luther King, faith is taking the first step, even when we cannot see the whole staircase. And this is the approach of Judaism and human rights to faith. Such elusiveness seems apparent in this week's Torah's reading, but Joseph, in the coming weeks of the Torah portions, and perhaps I should say spoiler alert, Joseph forgives his brothers, which was not something the brothers had thought possible. At the end of this Shabbat's reading, the Midianites, to whom the brothers have sold Joseph into slavery, the Midianites in turn sell him in Egypt to Potiphar, as we heard, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guards. When I was bat mitzvahed, my grandfather, an Orthodox refugee, gave me a copy of the Sonsino Chumash. The Sonsino Chumash translates the Hebrew words for the officer of the guard as the chief of executioners. If we look at the number of countries which executed those found guilty of a crime after judicial process in 1948, the year of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and compare it to now, we would see a significant reduction of countries who execute human beings. This includes the United Kingdom, which in 1948 also had retained the death penalty. Human rights have moved even further. There are treaties on children's rights, and the execution of those who commit crimes under the age of 18 is prohibited now by international law. This was even taken into account by the US Supreme Court when it outlawed the death penalty for children, even though it allows it in some cases for adults. So human rights works. Not all, not every time, but more often than we realize. It's because of human rights in the United Nations Charter that we have specialized agencies. The right to health is found in the Constitution of the World Health Organization, and its work has led to the eradication of polio and is currently reducing successfully the incidences of malaria around the world. Specialized bodies such as UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund, has helped reduce child deaths globally. And this is what we had in mind when we drafted the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. So human rights not only works, but it's capable of resolving major challenges. And focusing on the successes of human rights and how it reflects Jewish values as well as failures of human rights is important because it gives us the strength and the enthusiasm to continue. Human rights infuses our lives in this community, often without us noticing. This morning, the service has been beautifully led by Harriet and by our very distinguished senior rabbi, Rabbi Alex, something which would have been less likely 75 years ago, before the equality of women became a core principle of human rights. And we're also very privileged to have had gay and straight rabbis and gay and straight representatives of the Board of Deputies. And this is because Judaism, like human rights, expands and embraces the concept of dignity and equality for all. And this also illustrates why the Universal Declaration is so important. It provides a universally accepted framework in which we can ask for our rights to be respected and implemented. It's not a political party demand of the left, the right, or the centre. It's not asking for rights only for ourselves, but for all. It embraces Hillel's, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? And if I'm only for myself, what am I for? For those of us who were on the march against anti-Semitism, we were joined by vicars and priests, politicians, there were Kurdish banners, and it was led by the chief rabbi. This is because the right to religious freedom is a right enshrined in the Universal Declaration and acknowledges and is acknowledged by all democratic countries in the world, as well as being protected by national law. The media compared this recent march to the Cable Street March in the East End, in which my father and perhaps some of your families participated. But this march against anti-Semitism and at the interfaith gathering opposite Downing Street, the police were protecting us and not prioritising the demands of the far right. Because unlike 1936 and Cable Street, there is now a right to assemble peacefully. A few weeks ago, the marchers were holding placards and wearing stickers which said, "Our love is stronger than your hate." And this is not glib, or even at times an easy principle to live by, but it is one which emanates from sources, including human rights. It's very easy for me to believe in freedom of speech if you're saying very nice things about me, but it's a lot harder if I don't like what you have to say. Words hurt. They are power tools. So human rights protects free speech, but there are limits. And global treaties prohibit speech which incites race hate and which amounts to war propaganda. In the Torah, Joseph, after being put in the dried water cisterns, was sold by his brothers to a passing camel trade of Midianite merchants for 20 shekels. They took him to Egypt. In contemporary parlance, this selling into slavery is called trafficking, perfectly legal for much of human existence, including in biblical times, but it was first prohibited in international law by the League of Nations. And there has developed a range of international and national safeguards to both outlaw the practice and to prevent and to prosecute it. Human rights are sometimes ignored by some of us as being too individualistic, but this ignores the closing articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They provide that everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which the rights and freedoms in the Declaration can be fully realized. And it also reflects Judaism's approaches to the importance of community. The Declaration provides that everyone has duties to the community in which the freedom and the free and full development of personality is possible. And late Chief Rabbi Sachs said, "May each of us be an agent of hope, and together we may light up the world." I wish you all a peaceful and happy Chanukkah. Chanukkah Sameach.